There are no more apostles or prophets.
Is what I would say if I didn't believe in the biblical pattern of revelation, being that God calls prophets to guide his people.
The office of prophet and the office of apostle have closed. And it was not until heretical cults and prosperity traditions like Mormonism, Jehovah's Witness, and Word of Faith started using these titles to claim divine authority and manipulate their followers. There have been no apostles since the first century because there's been no more eyewitnesses of Jesus since the first century.
No eyewitnesses?
And when it comes to prophets, it's the same thing. While people still prophesy today, the actual role of prophet being the mouthpiece of God that can speak infallibly on behalf of him is closed.
Apostasy occurs when people reject the living prophets and believe that God no longer speaks through living oracles. The first century Jews who lived during the life of Jesus Christ were in apostasy. Jesus laments that they had stoned and killed the prophets. The Jewish leaders of the time, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, rejected God's living oracles and instead turned to their interpretation of the scriptures for answers. One of the major issues is that they disagreed on the interpretation of those scriptures and they twisted them to such a degree that they didn't recognize the Messiah when he arrived. Jesus and his apostles created new scripture, clarified old scripture, and reinterpreted existing scripture. When people disagreed on the interpretation of biblical passages, who breaks the tie? Prophets do. Prophets clarify and reinterpret existing scripture and are authorized to create new scripture. Today, there are living apostles and prophets on the earth who received authority from the resurrected New Testament apostles. This began with Joseph Smith and continues today with the first presidency and quorum of the 12 apostles. Those who reject the prophets are in apostasy. They instead turn to their own interpretation of the Bible. And what happens when they disagree on the interpretation of a biblical passage? A schism, a reformation, or a new denomination to add on to the thousands of existing ones. Similar to the Jews in the first century who rejected prophets and solely relied on the Torah, people reject the prophets and rely solely on the Bible today. Scripture can be twisted so that we no longer recognize the Messiah and his apostles. The living prophets are the authorities to interpret Scripture and its meaning. They create new Scripture and point us towards the promised land just like all the prophets before. When one rejects God's living prophets in favor of what old prophets wrote down, that is apostasy. We live in a new apostolic age, just like the first century Jews after Christ's resurrection. Come and see.